Today I want you to think about what you consider to be your worst day ever. Now, I know that's not a pleasant thought. It can involve things like loss and tragedy, heartbreak and failure. Not fun to think about stuff like that. If you ask a certain group of Galilean women in the first century what their absolutely worst day of their life was, they'd all come up with the same answer. The day that they stood near the cross of Jesus and watched him die. The pain, loss, and heartbreak that they felt on that day was greater than anything they felt before or after. Now let's switch gears. Now I want you to think about what you consider to be your best day ever. And we like to think about those days. These days include things like birthdays and friendships and vacations, pleasant thoughts. Now on those days we feel happiness and joy, fulfillment and peace. Well, if you ask the same group of first century Galilean women what their best day ever was, again, they'd have identical answers. It was the day, ironically enough, that they went to the tomb to care for Jesus' dead body. It was a great day because they didn't find Jesus' dead body. Instead, they were met with an angel who told them something that brought them joy beyond anything imaginable. Because he said that Jesus had risen. We see the story in Luke 24, verse 1. On the first day of the week, very early in the morning, the women took the spices they had prepared and went to the tomb. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they entered, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. So women went to the tomb. Let's think first about the tomb itself. Back in those days, there were two methods of burying. Most people would be buried in the ground, and their grave would be marked by a pile of rocks. And the rocks had a purpose. The purpose of the rocks was to keep the animals away from the tomb, to keep the animals from desecrating the tomb. Well, wealthy people would be buried in a cave-like tomb. It'd be carved from limestone to make a small room where the body would be placed. So the women went to that kind of a tomb, a cave-like tomb where Jesus' body was laid. This was a tomb that we know was provided by Joseph of Arimathea, a wealthy member of the Sanhedrin who secretly believed in Jesus. Well, next, let's think about the women. Who were they? Well, first there was Mary Magdalene. And Magdalene means she lived in Magdala, a town on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee. And Mary had been a loyal follower of Christ. Jesus had cast out 7 demons from her, and Jesus' first appearance to any human after his resurrection was to Mary Magdalene. Next listed is Joanna, the wife of Chuza, one of Herod's officials. And Herod is Herod Antipas, the Roman ruler over Galilee and Perea at the time. And it was this same Herod who beheaded John the Baptist and tried Jesus before his crucifixion. So Joanna is married to one of Herod's officials and is the manager of Herod's household. So she has a degree of status. And yet Joanna is also one of Christ's followers. It's interesting that someone like Joanna, who works for Herod along with her husband, is also a Christ follower. That must have made for some very interesting conversations at home, right? And then there's Mary, the mother of James. And the James that is linked to this mother is probably James of Alphaeus. She was probably part of the group of women who followed Jesus and his disciples and provided food for them. And then there were other women as well. And notice, only women. These women, out of love and loyalty to Christ, ventured out at the first opportunity they had to visit Jesus' tomb. All these women were followers of Christ. And what were they doing? Well, the women were going to Jesus' tomb in order to anoint the body with spices. Spices and perfumes. They were used to mask the odor of a decomposing corpse. So one thing is obvious. These women did not go to the tomb believing in the resurrection. They weren't checking out the tomb to see if maybe the tomb was empty. They took spices with them to anoint a dead body. None of Jesus' followers actually expected Jesus to rise from the grave, even though we find 6 resurrection predictions in Luke's gospel. And so, The mood as these women ventured to the cross would be extremely subdued. They were depressed and exhausted, in mourning. They had watched Jesus die and saw him buried. They had no hope. But out of their great love for their dead master, they visited his grave with their spices. Jesus' body had already been prepared for burial with spices and perfumes by Joseph and Nicodemus when they buried him. John's Gospel said that Nicodemus brought about 75 pounds of myrrh and aloes to the tomb for Jesus' burial. Now think about that, 75 pounds of this sweet-smelling stuff. Have you ever bought dog food at Costco? The dog food there comes in these gigantic 40-pound bags. And these bags are so big they're rather difficult to lift and get into your cart. So 2 of these bags would be about 80 pounds. 80 pounds, that's very close to the weight of spices and perfumes that Nicodemus used for Jesus' burial. That's a lot of spices. So why so much? Well, I believe the amount was extreme for a purpose. Such an extravagant amount would be an amount used for a king, and Joseph and Nicodemus were giving Jesus a burial fit for a king. But then the women come back in a couple days, bringing spices they had prepared. The word prepared might carry some significance. These women put time and effort into getting just the right spices together to bring to Jesus' burial site. And today we got it easy, right? Today we can just go online, order 75 pounds of a pre-mixed spice blend from Amazon, and have it delivered directly to the gravesite the next day, with free shipping from Amazon Prime. But these women prepared their spices for Jesus. They were personally involved, buying the spices, mixing the spices, transporting the spices for the purpose of using the spices for Jesus. They got their hands dirty for their Lord. We don't know how much they brought, but I really doubt it was the 75 pounds worth. But the amount isn't really the point. The point is that it was given out of love and respect. Joseph and Nicodemus didn't bring an extravagant gift in order to show off. They were respecting Jesus as a king and giving him a proper burial as such. And if the women's gift wasn't quite as much monetarily, it was still valuable to Christ. It was offered in love. A sincere service to Christ doesn't mean we have to offer a lot. It means we have to give our best. And that's the lesson that Jesus taught in the temple with the poor woman who gave 2 coins as an offering. She didn't have a lot to give, but she held nothing back. Well, when did they go? Well, they went very early in the morning when the Sabbath ended. In the Jewish way of counting time in that era, any portion of a day could count for a day. So let's look at the timeline. Jesus died on Friday at about 3 p.m. And Joseph had taken his body and buried it just before the Sabbath began at sundown on Friday. So although the time between Jesus dying and being buried was only about 3 hours, it counts as a day in Jewish thought. So that's the first day. The Sabbath continued for 24 hours, ending at sunset on Saturday, so that would be considered as 2 days. And then Sunday begins as Sabbath ends at sunset. And that would be the beginning of the 3rd day. And the women ventured out very early on Sunday morning. After Jesus was crucified, these women followed Joseph and Nicodemus to the tomb. And one of the purposes they had in following Joseph and Nicodemus was to see where the tomb was located. After all, these women weren't from around here. They were from Galilee, not Judea. They lived 75 miles away. So just as when we go to a new city, it takes time to figure out where things are and how to get around, they were facing the same thing. And so they set out very early at daybreak. They needed the light to help them find the tomb again. And besides, it wouldn't have been safe for these women from Galilee to try to locate this tomb in the darkness of night outside the city walls. Well, what did they discover? Well, first we see what they did find. They found that the stone was rolled away from the tomb. We know from Mark's Gospel that on their way to the tomb, they've been wondering, who's going to roll away that heavy stone from the tomb's entrance so they could go inside? And they obviously didn't think they could do it, and they certainly couldn't count on the Roman soldiers guarding the tomb to help out. And so obviously there were some holes in their plan. They didn't have all the logistics worked out. But then they arrived at the scene and saw the entrance to the tomb just wide open. Well, this would cause them to be confused and worried. It'd be somewhat like coming home after a trip and seeing the door to your house just wide open. Your first thought would not be, oh good, I don't have to unlock the door. No, your first thought is, oh no, something's really wrong here. That's exactly what these women thought when they saw the stone rolled away. Something is really wrong. Then we discover what they did not find. They did not find Jesus' body. They went inside the tomb with their spices. In tombs like these, the body would be wrapped in linen and laid out on a shelf. And the body would lay in the tomb for about a year or so. And by that time, only a skeleton would remain. And then the bones would be placed in a box and put on a shelf in the tomb to complete the burial process. So at this time, the women were expected to see a body laid out on a shelf. But there was no body. Where the body should have been, they only saw the linen cloth that Jesus was wrapped in. Now, in our Easter way of thinking, we rejoice at the fact that there was not a body in the tomb. We've gotten used to the idea that Jesus has risen. But for these ladies, the empty tomb just added to their stress. Their immediate thought would not have been that Jesus was alive, that the body was stolen. The empty tomb was first considered just horrible news. We pick it up in verse 4. While they were wondering about this, suddenly 2 men in clothes that gleamed like lightning stood beside them. In their fright, the women bowed down with their faces to the ground. But the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here. He has risen. Remember how he told you while he was still with you in Galilee? The Son of Man must be delivered over to the hands of sinners, be crucified, and on the 3rd day be raised again." Then they remembered his words. Well, the 2 men were angels. And when angels appear, they often appear suddenly. Things that happen suddenly can be quite a shock. Sudden things catch us off guard and unprepared. When the angels appear in the Bible stories, they tend to do it suddenly. You know, if an angel slowly walked up to me, that would be shocking enough. But that's not the way they do things. Instead, one moment they're not there, and then the next they're suddenly there. And that's pretty scary stuff. Well, obviously the women recognized these men as angels because they bowed down with their faces to the ground. These weren't ordinary people. First, because they could suddenly appear out of nowhere, and second, because they had these clothes that gleamed like lightning. That's not something you see every day, clothes that glow. Well, the angels ask an interesting question. Why do you look for the living among the dead? The inside of a tomb is where dead people are kept. It isn't where living people are hanging out. Nobody would throw a dinner party inside a tomb. So the point they were making is that Jesus should not even be in the tomb because he is not dead. He's alive. And they said it so plainly, just in case the women didn't quite understand their question. They said, "He is not here. He is risen." There are 2 3-word statements that just bring tremendous joy to every Christian. And the first is, Christ is born. Those words tell us that Jesus came into a world in human form in order to bring us back to God. And Christmas is a joyful time as we celebrate God coming into the world. He was born into the world with the mission of dying for the world's sin. Well, the second joy-causing phrase is, "He is risen." And this phrase is the cornerstone of the Christian faith. Unless Christ rose from the dead, we have nothing to celebrate. We have no one to worship. We have nothing to live for. But Christ is risen. He has victory over sin and death. And because he lives, we have purpose in life and the promise of an eternity with him. When the angel said these words, it all started coming back to the women. They remembered that Jesus had said these things. Everything had occurred just as Jesus had said. And so these women left the tomb and rushed back to tell his 11 disciples. Verse 9. When they came back from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and to all the others. It was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the others with them who told this to the apostles. But they did not believe the women, because their words seemed to them like nonsense. So it was the women that first discovered the empty tomb on Sunday morning. And it was to the women that the resurrected Jesus first appeared. When the disciples heard the news from the women that Jesus was risen, you would think they'd be just overexcited. However, they weren't. The disciples did not believe the women. The disciples were the first unbelievers. The news was just unbelievable. The disciples must have thought that the women must have gone to the wrong tomb. Women in that day and in that culture were not considered reliable witnesses. The Greek word that Luke used to describe the women's story is leros. And leros can be translated nonsense or idle talk. It was a word used in everyday Greek to refer to crazy stories told by people who are very sick and in great pain, or to tales told by people who fail to perceive reality. So at first, the disciples thought the women just had a screw loose. They were talking crazy. None of what they said made any sense. In the way that Jewish people understood the resurrection, the dead were resurrected at the end of time. Resurrections weren't supposed to happen within history. So when Jesus told them plainly that he would soon die and be resurrected, they probably believed him, but they were convinced that he would be resurrected at the end of time along with everyone else. So not only were women considered generally unreliable witnesses, these women had just taken it to another level. So let's think about that. Considering that the men believed that the words of women, and particularly these women, could not be trusted, it's unlikely that the followers of Jesus would have made up stories in which women were the primary witnesses to the empty tomb. If they had made up the whole resurrection story, they certainly would have had men discover the empty tomb so that people would be more apt to believe it. But the fact that women witnesses to the empty tomb indicates that this story is not made up at all. It really happened. There are a lot of people who dismiss the story of Christ's resurrection by saying it's just a made-up story by people who in their own minds really wanted to believe that Jesus had risen. So they put together a story that fit their happy ending of the life of Christ. But that's not how the story reads at all. The women weren't looking for a happy ending. They were bringing spices to the tomb to anoint a dead body. The disciples weren't looking for a happy ending. They thought that the women's story was just beyond crazy. Not even the empty tomb convinced the disciples. And Peter ran to see the tomb for himself, but he left more confused than ever. But in time, they all believed as Jesus made himself known. Even doubting Thomas, the skeptic in the group, came to believe in the risen Lord. And as they came to believe with all their hearts that Jesus truly had risen, their lives changed. Instead of hiding in hopelessness, they started meeting for prayer, worship, and fellowship. They boldly proclaimed that Jesus lives, even though it put their very lives at risk. Their lives now had purpose and power because Jesus lives and his Spirit lived in them. So it's not delirious babblings. It's not a fairy tale. It's not wishful thinking. It's the truth. Jesus, the Son of God, rose from the dead. And so today we have a faith worth believing, a faith worth living for, and a hope for tomorrow, all because Jesus lives.